Thank you, Coach. Thank you all for being here. I'm gonna move this up just a little bit. Being back in, I sometimes kick my feet a bit when I read, and I'm afraid of kicking that wall and spraining an ankle. I do have technically 1 year of college eligibility left when it comes to athletics, so I don't want to injure myself before the season starts. Who knows? If this conversation goes well enough, I could be playing point guard maybe. I'm going to read a bit from There's Always This Year, and I'm going to read two things that are not next to each other in the book but do connect. I'm going to read about Tamir Rice and Michael Brown, and then I'm going to read about this commercial that most people do not remember if you are not an Ohioan. But when LeBron came back to the Cavs, Nike made this commercial that only aired 2 times. It was this black and white commercial called Together, wherein, I'm not going to describe the commercial because I'm going to literally read a pretty vivid, hopefully, description of it. But the commercial, the reason no one remembers it is because it aired right before the Cavs played in the first game when LeBron came back. It aired at the very end of that game, and it never aired again, on TV at least. It's very much on YouTube. And what I am going to read is thinking about a through line of how cities are sometimes, or often perhaps, dishonest about what they actually represent and how that dishonesty can seduce us into belief, which I think is perhaps most useful in sports fandom. As I say, I'm a massive sports fan, so thank you for this. I'm going to read, I'll read about 7-ish minutes, but forgive me if it stretches to 8. I'm going to start kind of in the middle of a thought. The person who called the police on Tamir Rice mentioned the gun was probably fake, that the boy pointing it at the park in Cleveland just a few days before Thanksgiving in 2014 was probably a child, but the information wasn't passed on to the officers who were dispatched to the scene. I don't believe this changes anything, and it is only something I return to because the initial caller, even in their assertion that Tamir was a child, did it with attentiveness, something that echoed through the aftermath of his murder. Friends, we are far removed from our initial talk of enemies and talk of how the past self can blur into the present self, but when I say I don't remember myself or some of my loved ones as children, what I mean to say is that their faces now are the faces I love the most. I mean to say that I am intentionally blurring a past where I might not have loved you the way I do now. That might be a somewhat foolish politic, but it is one I am rooted in, a far cry from our enemies who seem to measure childhood through a lens of who does and does not deserve to have one, a childhood of both the ecstatic and the frightening, teeming with joys and mistakes. In the midst of mourning Tamir and marching for Tamir, I grew weary of any conversation that returned to and landed on his appearance, how he looked, if he was big for his age. No one bandying these debates around ever really specified what rested on the other side of them, what it might mean if he were, in fact, big for his age. I suppose the reality is that no one had to say what many of us already knew. People were looking for a way out, a way to feel all right about the murder. Sure, it looked bad, but if he was large enough or dangerous enough, then what could anyone be expected to do, really? I found myself recalling Darren Wilson, the police officer who killed Michael Brown in 2014. Part of his defense was that he believed Michael Brown to be a demon. Wilson actually said, I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan, and like that, Wilson became the child, Brown became superhuman, monstrous, thunderously raining down havoc upon a city. With Tamir Rice, similar thoughts were thrown about. People would discuss his height and weight down to the inches and pounds. It never seemed to cross their minds that what was on the table in the discussion was never how large Tamir actually was or wasn't, but how large and dangerous he was in the eyes of a police officer with a gun pointed at him. And that, of course, becomes malleable when filtered through the state and its desire to absolve itself of violence. So many police officers with guns on their hips or in their hands insist that they are afraid depending on who the perpetrator is. They insist that they themselves feel small in the face of danger, like Darren Wilson invoking his 5-year-old self to make sense of why he had to murder the massive, hulking black teenager who otherwise surely would have killed him. This weaving in and out of childhood is a convenient weapon, one not afforded to everyone. Friends, we are actually not far removed from our talk of enemies, not far removed from the moment when I tried and failed to reach for the images of my boyish self, the childhood selves of many people I love, not far removed from you, perhaps looking in the mirror and trying to reimagine your own self without the gallery of age exhibiting itself upon your now too familiar structures. I let us off the hook too early there. I turned us away from that moment of somewhat hazardous thought before I could pull some clarity from the mess, but it isn't only about how we appear, friends. It isn't only about memory. It isn't only about the sounds that carry us back to a younger self or elsewhere, or the fireflies, or the joyful humidity of a summer with no rules. Innocence is the key that unlocks the box holding all the aesthetics within, or at least the perception of innocence. I'm not sure when childhood was first coded as innocent, but it has often struck me that to understand childhood as a window curtained by a monolithic innocence takes a very specific kind of commitment to mythology, one that I have not been able to touch. I don't believe in innocence, which is another weapon of convenience. I have no use for innocence beyond the dead. The dead are innocent, departed from the treachery of the world, even if what comes after this life is an eternal mass of darkness, one the dead don't realize they're waiting in, even that affords them an innocence, an escape from what has taken us a lifetime to survive. The commercial is a black and white scene. The announcer, finishing a starting lineup, calls LeBron James to the center of the floor, and when James gets there, the team huddles around him while he begins a speech, something about how whatever must be done has to be done for Cleveland, how the city has been waiting for this moment, and so the team has no choice but to rise to the occasion. Yes, the sometimes flimsy barrier that exists between a team and a place is disrupted here, torn right down in the first 15 seconds of the commercial, and that is the first and most vicious seduction. When the team pulls in for a tighter huddle, putting their arms around each other, a person emerges from the stands, one at first, and then a small handful of others, and then a wave of others, all of them joining the huddle, putting their arms around each other. From inside the arena, fans crowd the tunnel, march through the overpass leading inside the arena, pulled towards the already growing huddle, seeking anyone to put an arm around. And outside of the arena, people crowd under trees and reach out for a nearby shoulder. Small children rush to the edges of buildings overlooking Quicken Loans Arena and the crowd that has mysteriously grown outside of it. All of them linked together, arms around each other. LeBron is not finished with his speech, though his voice has grown quieter as the arena has gone silent, but for the swelling drone of prolonged keys and horns writhing underneath the scene. Everything the team does has to be for the city, LeBron says. It's a question of debt, LeBron says. The city has been waiting for so long. Surely the Cavs owe them one. In a different context, these platitudes might not even register, might summon a yawn from even the most easily enthused by sports cliche, but while he speaks, the city's people grow around the language. They crowd the alleyways and spread in the downtown. They line the docks of the river. They are on rooftops, crowding bridges, gazing from windows. In the magic of the commercial, they can all hear LeBron, though his voice has numbed to a near whisper inside of the arena. Fans outside nod along with his voice. They lean in and furrow their brows. They affix looks of determination to their faces. And yes, this might be the point where you understand, or at least can be swayed into believing, that what is being discussed here is destiny. Finally, the pin is out of the grenade. LeBron James making clear what was already assumed. Not just, I came here to win, but we will win together. My God, the greatest lies are told in the name of sports, in the name of teams and cities and people in them. People who do march from the docks to the doors of an arena. People who do save up some coin to get seats in the highest corner of the rafters, closer to the kingdom of heaven than he who would be named king. The greatest lies are told in the name of what people believe they can reach out and touch. How the idea of winning in a place where no one believes you to be a winner can summon the heart to leap from the edge of a cliff, praying to land in a sea of outstretched hands. There are worse lies than this, ones that I'm less prone to be seduced by in a moment of weakness or in a moment of dreaming. And in the commercial, the people are still marching. The boy with a shock of curly hair grinning wide from his father's shoulders, the people exiting cars and following the traveling masses. LeBron laying out the instructions. Hard work on 3, together on 6. And with the first hard work echoing through the Cleveland streets, a small flock of birds startles and trickles away from the top of the Guardians Bridge. By the second rotation of hard work together, the people are swaying now, their arms still slung around each other's shoulders, but all of them locked in a rhythmic exchange, a collective metronome. And the children, yes, those still living children I promised you once before we arrived here, before we had to wade through the real bullets and the real bombs, before we had to drag ourselves past the real funerals and the real fires. I'm sorry I kept us away from our miracles for so long, but the living black children in this commercial are gleefully slapping the glass windows on a school bus, their smiles and small hands visible only for a gasp of a scene, but long enough for its sweetness to echo. And by now, the people in the streets have given up on waiting for numbers or instruction, have even forsaken the calm rhythm they once built among each other. They simply shout together and rushed in breathless unison, no longer swaying but leaping from side to side so loud it summons reinforcements who most certainly arrive. Black boys trekking up hills and a congregation pouring out the doors of a church. This is it, the hopeful city and its many dreamers. The barrier between team and city and people already trembling under the weight of all this finally dissolves. And if you can believe it, there is more. The moment that even even now, sends me over an edge I would turn away from if I could, but I cannot, not with what I know of how this ends, not with what you know either. I say this and mean the world outside of the 2-minute commercial selling less of a product and more of a universe of boundless pleasure, which is easy to do when there is not yet a real game to be won or lost. Praise of fantasies that can spring to life while all potential for agony rests. When LeBron James puts up his fist, a team joins him, the team being everyone, the entire city, a unified ascension of closed fists and single index fingers that happens in waves, first inside the arena and then out. A toddler's small fist jerks up in an attempt to meet the fist of their mother. People attempt stoicism with their fists pushing into the sky but can't help but be overtaken by looks of self-satisfaction. It was in this closing moment, watching for the first time in my apartment in Connecticut, that I realized, my apartment which was like right down the street, that I realized I had at some point during this 2 minutes entirely descended from my seat on the couch and ended up on the floor, leaning against the couch. There is a feeling of knowing and understanding that you have been crying, but not fully grasping the velocity with which the crying has overtaken you, until you realize you are, in fact, gasping in a darkness that feels new, but has always been there. I've told you before, nostalgia is a relentless hustler, relies on how bad anyone wants to retrieve a feeling or even an idea of a feeling. And so I say, I remember when I saw people embracing, and it did confirm whatever myths I built around how any of us love or live or survive in a place that tries to tear people at the margins to pieces. But a more honest understanding of this is that all of our living can so easily be turned into decoration. We can become the flowers lining the sidewalks where people sleep and are stepped over. We can become the golden smoke winding over the lake, the cannons and the confetti coughed from their mouths. We lend our living to fantasies, sometimes without even knowing we are doing it, never too far removed from being in the palm of a city's imagination, while someone far away whispers, "Isn't this the most beautiful thing you've ever seen?" Hey, Coach.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, I was asked to be the moderator here and to ask questions to Hanif. And, after listening to that, I'm going in another direction here. My first thought is, why those two segments did you choose to preach to us?
Yeah. Am I sounding okay? Okay. I love that commercial, and I watch it really religiously. I mean, I watch that commercial still once a month, I think, and I love it because of its mythology. I mean, I'm from Columbus and not Cleveland, but I have such a relationship with that commercial because my friends were in that. When that commercial was filmed, does anyone, by show of hands, anyone remember that commercial? I know it's often very few people who do. My friends were extras in that commercial, because when that commercial was, Nike was kind of just like, if you live in Cleveland and have a free afternoon and want to just run into the streets, please come, And so one of my dear friend's little babies was in that commercial, and who's now like a full child. And so I have a real relationship with that commercial. And even though my relationship with that commercial is what it is, I am aware of the fact that mere months before it was filmed, Tamir Rice was murdered, And so Cleveland was operating, when LeBron returned to Cleveland was operating in this kind of dual mythology reality tunnel that collided, I think, in that commercial, because as much as it is beautiful and regenerating for me to watch little babies being carried through the streets of Cleveland, we, months earlier than that, witnessed the funeral of a child, an actual child in that same city. And so those two things collide, I think, in the fourth quarter of the book, asking ourselves, what are we willing to ignore about a city's truth in order to lie to ourselves so we feel good for a small moment, which we all do. I mean, I do, I'm not yet.
Right. So let me lighten this up a little bit.
Please, yeah.
Who's better, LeBron or Jordan? So he starts, so let me just frame it for you. So I got the book, and I don't often have time to read for pleasure. And I actually read a book before I read yours. And when I got to it, the book I had previously read, Who Shall Go Nameless, is like reading The Cat in the Hat in comparison to what you put to paper.
Thank you.
And I was completely enthralled by it because you started talking about basketball, and I was in Ohio as an assistant coach, and a lot of this that went on. Yeah, at OU, and you talked about Brookhaven and Bruce Howard, and so I was automatically caught. And then you snuck a book in on me, right? Like you started talking about the world within it, and you know, that was great. But I was curious, you know, you talked about Jordan to start.
Yeah.
Who's the better player?
The way I normally get out of answering this is I say that but I will answer. But the way I normally get out of answering is that I say that I'm really fortunate to be someone who got to watch both of them in their primes. I'm of a certain age. Like I think there are people who are just younger than me who didn't see Jordan in his prime, but I got to see both of them in their primes, and that's just singular. That said, I'm a real body of work person, and I mean, obviously I love LeBron deeply, deeply love LeBron. I'm also a big body of work person, and I just can't get away from the fact that Michael Jordan never lost in the finals. Never lost in the finals. I just think that's like massively impressive.
Yes. Stop clapping. Stop clapping. that did not go the way I thought it was going to go.
Deeply, I love LeBron, and I will say, while Jordan never lost in the finals, what LeBron did in the 2016 finals is like something I've never seen. I mean, that was like, I thought I was dreaming. I mean, truly, I've never seen anything like that. And so, you know, I'm thankful I've gotten to watch them both.
And so my daughter was born in '96, and I can't remember what championship that was for the Bulls when they won. So I was, you know, all in on Jordan. I have a brother, and if I could show you my phone, I have two brothers, and they argue every freaking day on who's better, Jordan or LeBron. And for me, I'm in a LeBron camp for the simple reason of what the man has been able to do for what seems like 107 years.
No, I feel that.
You know, he's 40 years old, and what he's been able to do has been nothing short of amazing.
Yeah, I mean, trust me, he and I are the same age right now, and that makes me distinctly aware of that makes me distinctly aware of the brilliance that he is, you know, on the days where it's like, getting out of bed is a challenge.
Yeah, you're worried about kicking a wall and being able to play.
Yeah.
And this guy's playing against the young guys and the best in the world.
It's impressive. I mean, truly, and I think that he is, I don't think we'll ever see a player play that long again. Like, I don't think the game is set up for a player to play that long. And it's been a pleasure to watch every inch of his career. It's from the first time I saw him when he was a sophomore in high school to now.
So, you know, you're an Ohio guy, and all of a sudden, this decision comes up on ESPN. We got the polo shirt on or whatever. And he's on TV and going to announce the ridiculousness of all that.
Yeah.
And you know, you talk about, and I could feel the love that you have where you're from through your writing and what it did. And I know how much LeBron leaving changed Cleveland. In the sense of, like, people don't understand that everybody who worked the gates at games, well, they don't have a job. The people who own restaurants around the stadium, they don't have a job. The people who park cars don't have a job. So what that does, what he did leaving to the economy of Cleveland was very difficult for it to handle. So, but as a person who grew up there and loved it and wanted to see it successful, like the King coming in and having it done and him leaving before winning the championship, what did that look like for you and your friends?
It was in some ways devastating. I read about this in the book a little bit, but I remember watching the We Are All Witnesses poster come down piece by piece. That was in some ways really devastating to me because for years that was the definitive thing. You know, you drive into downtown Cleveland and you see the We Are All Witnesses poster, and watching it they didn't take it down in one bit. They took it down like several weeks at a time, panel by panel, until all that was left was a black strip that said Ness. And I remember, and it was just his hand because the poster was of him like flying through the air. And that was really devastating. You talk about the financial part of it. That part, the downturn, the economic downturn of Cleveland, that they did not recover from for a long time. Even after he returned, Cleveland still was fighting to recover from that. Because when he returned, there were people who were skeptical, people who still didn't come to the games. But I will say this, I loved the Cavs the year after LeBron left was I think maybe the worst NBA team ever. That roster, I think, is the worst NBA roster that's been, you know, I know the Pistons lost all those games last year, but there was talent on that team. That Cavs team, and I love Boobie Gibson, you know, I love some of those guys, but that team was so bad that because no one was going to the games, my friends and I would get the cheapest tickets possible. And we would just walk around the arena and sit wherever we wanted. And so there was a real miracle in that because, yes, the economic downturn was bad, but for a bunch of like poor kids and punk kids like I was coming up with, we could go to games for $5 and sit courtside, you know? And yeah, they only won like 14, 15 games, but, you know, that was special too, I think.
So when he left and people burned his jersey, you spoke about that in the book, and people burned his jersey. And what struck me, you talked about how everyone that was interviewed, everybody around that fire seemed to be white.
Oh, yeah.
And you talk about where the voices of the people who basically look like him. Like, what was that feeling like to see that and to view that?
It was interesting because a lot of the black folks I know weren't interested in discarding him, even though they're angry. You know, I think sometimes there's a sense of entitlement in sports, in all kinds of consumption, be it music, sports, all kinds of popular culture consumption, where we, the consumers, believe we're owed something by the person who is producing. I have to say, I wasn't that mad at LeBron for leaving. And also, one thing people don't remember, and I don't know if there's any Cavs fans in the rooms, but hold your Cavs fans, friends accountable, is Cavs fans, after that Celtics series, wanted him gone. Cavs fans, after that Celtics series, were talking out of their minds. You know what I mean? Like, they were like, we don't need him to win. This dude's got to, they thought he was like, they thought he sabotaged the series. And they were like, he's got to get out of here. We got to start fresh. And then when LeBron was like, okay, I'm going, it was like, oh, we were just joking. You know what I mean? It was like, oh, no, we were just playing around. And so the atmosphere for him was hostile. Like, I don't think he couldn't have come back to that team. It's unfortunate for Cleveland fans, I understand, because quite frankly, like Miami LeBron is maybe the best version of LeBron, and I think that people maybe don't appreciate that because he was teamed up with the quote-unquote super team. But if you Miami LeBron on tape is like, I don't know what I'm watching. It's like watching a superhero playing against, like, it's like watching like a mutant escape from Professor X's camp, and it's just like playing pickup with a bunch of normal people. Like Miami LeBron is, and I know Wade was great, and I know Bosh was important, but if you watch the tape of Miami LeBron, it's like nothing else. And so I understand that Cleveland was deprived of perhaps the greatest era of the greatest player who's ever played for the franchise. But I think there's a real lesson there in the entitlement of sports fandom, though. Judging from the discourse of sports fandom, I feel like no one learned that lesson.
You mentioned something in the book that really struck me. The dignity that your friends gave you when you lost your home.
Yeah.
And you talked about how, like, you know, again, I'm just visualizing this, your friends coming to the door to knock on it and someone answering it. Noticing that you might have had the same clothes on for a couple of days, and the woman that was at the storage unit and who just gave you the dignity of being you without just stepping away and not asking. How was that experience for you, and did it shape you, change you, do anything different to you, like understanding who you were?
Yeah, well, one big thing it did for me is it forced me to extend grace to people. I think I had a lot of grace extended to me when I was unhoused. I could afford a gym membership, and I would often, I could afford a membership at the YMCA, which back then was like $12 a month, maybe even 10, and that was just to shower. I went there, I'd maybe do a pickup run just to kind of keep up appearances, and then I would just shower. And I would wander around the city, I think, but people were generous to me. If you're unhoused, and I think for those of you who live in New Haven, I hope you are thinking about this too, it is so easy to make an unhoused population either invisible or a nuisance because people don't believe that these are your neighbors. But if you live in, say, downtown New Haven, every resident is a resident. It doesn't matter if they are sleeping on the green or if they're sleeping in an apartment on State Street. If we want to strip this down to its bare bones, by sheer virtue of proximity, by definition, by plain actual definition, that is your neighbor. And so the question is, what grace do you want to afford your neighbors who are in different circumstances than you are? Which, to be clear, is all of our neighbors. I live in a neighborhood in Columbus. The person who lives in the house next to me is living under different circumstances than I am living in, just as a person who stands on the corner of the street by the stoplight with a sign asking for change is a neighbor of mine living under different circumstances. But I didn't learn any of the machinery of that until I was unhoused and required people to treat me as though I was their neighbor, or at least was without language asking people to have grace for me. And I remember the people who do, just as I remember the people who don't, but I more importantly remember the people who do because they set a blueprint for me. You know, the person who worked at the church who would let me sleep an extra hour on the pews before, you know, these kind of things where you do not have to do this. Christina Sharp said something in our conversation perhaps yesterday where she was like, I refuse to, if we are believed that we are supposed to go in the world and treat people as invisible, I refuse to accept that. And as someone who was treated as invisible sometimes when I was unhoused, I also come into the world now and say, I just refuse to accept that the only options are stepping over our neighbors or antagonizing them. There's a wide berth in the middle that is defined by the grace that we're willing to show, and I feel like I have to have a high capacity for it. I hope that I would have a high capacity for it even if I wasn't in that situation, but because I was, that capacity is
no question.
Through the roof. Yeah.
No question. And then this is something that, you know, you're a younger man than I, but we shared a love of some similar music.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, as a metaphor, you talked about like Otis Redding, and you talked about Marvin Gaye and James Brown as that begging subgenre.
Yeah.
And I thought that was like really cool for me, like to read about, you know, because those are some of my favorites.
Absolutely.
Of all time. And you know, in fact, again, you're a younger man that you know Marvin Gaye, and you know, it's wonderful. And for me to listen to that and how you blended it with people begging to come back for LeBron.
Right. Yeah.
You know, I just thought that was really, really tremendous and a great way to tell that side of the story.
Yeah, you don't want someone back until they're gone, because all those begging songs that we know and love, right? Those songs, like they begin when, and it's
Oh,
always,
baby, baby.
it's always men. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
they begin when the woman is already out the door. You know what I mean? It's never like, wait, you're still here. I can be better. Don't leave. It's like, all right, I messed up, and you're gone. You're like perhaps long gone. You know, it's not like the bags are packed by the door. It's like she is on the train to another city, my boy. You know what I mean? It's like, and it's always like, oh, you know, Boys to Men on that kind of like, you know, silk suits in the rain, you know, but I love that subgenre of song. I love that kind of, in the velocity with which that was happening with LeBron in Cleveland, where it was like, we wanted him gone, and then once he left, and they had to watch, you know, respectfully, they had to watch like Mo Williams, they had to watch like Ricky Davis shooting 1 million shots a game. It was like, all right, man, like anything, whatever it takes, you know. And then I write about that scene in Cleveland where the dude ran on the floor. Does anyone remember this? Where the guy in Cleveland, the first time, or in the second Miami LeBron season, the Heat played in Cleveland, and a guy ran on the floor. It's so wild that this happened, because now if this happened, I feel like there would be 1 million police surrounding him, but a dude just ran on the floor and he had on a shirt that said, LeBron, please come back. And LeBron was so generous to this dude. It was wild. Like, he was startled at first, but once he saw that, he was like, shook the guy's hand and patted him on the shoulder. It was so, I remember that so vividly, because that signaled to me that LeBron also understood the ache that was present after he exited. And that is perhaps the best way to receive a begging song, even if you know you're not coming back, to say, thanks for the effort.
So, listen, I got 1,000 questions I could ask you. You mentioned in the book several times that you didn't want to be any place than where you were.
Yeah.
You didn't want to leave there. But did you have what were your hoop dreams? See, for me, I was going to graduate high school, go play for Dean Smith at North Carolina, win a gold medal in the Olympics, and then go be the point guard for the Knicks. That was my trajectory till reality set in, and I realized I wasn't any damn good. So for you, like, what was your hoop dream? What were you thinking? What that look like for you?
I also wanted to play for the Knicks. I grew up in a household of Knicks fans. My family's all from the East Coast.
North New Jersey, that's right.
Yeah. My mom loved Charles Smith. My mom loved Charles Smith so much. Are there any like 90s Knicks fans in here, like legit 90s Knicks fans? So some of you will remember, when I say Charles Smith, you'll remember the devastating, the missed tip, when he missed all those tips in that game. Oh my God, it was like devastating. My household was devastated. So I loved the Knicks. I didn't love the Knicks. I wanted to play for the Knicks, and my parents loved the Knicks, and my brother loved John Starks, and my mom loved Charles Smith, and I liked Hubert Davis for some reason. But I also knew I've been the same height since I was like 12, and but I was trained as a point guard, thankfully, because when you're young and you're maybe a little bit taller, the mistake a lot of early coaches make is, let's train you in the post, because they think you're going to keep growing. But I had coaches who thankfully looked at me, and looked at my mom was 4'11", my dad's like 5'6", so I had coaches who looked at me, looked at my parents. It's like, all right, we're going to teach you how to dribble. You know what I mean? We're going to teach you how to dribble. We're going to teach you how to pass. We're going to teach you how to shoot. We're definitely going to teach you how to shoot a floater. That was a major thing with me. And so I thought, at some point I was like, I just kind of want to play in high school. Okay. And, I kind of want to play with my friends. I kind of want to, in Columbus at the time, I did come up in that era of Brookhaven. And for those who don't know, Brookhaven was like a massive powerhouse school in Columbus. And, I went to Beechcroft, which was a rival school to Brookhaven, and all I really wanted was to go up against those guys. I just wanted to see what I was made of. But I'm sure you were just talking about like playing against Kenny Smith, and you play against certain guys, and that's when that is when you realize, you know what I mean, like
Aka.
Yeah, like you line up, and my guy was Drew Lavender, the point guard for Brookhaven. You line up against Drew Lavender, and he goes past you like as fast as just walking, and then you go, okay, well I gotta. Maybe school's the answer. Maybe it's time for me to learn a trade.
Yeah, that kind of hits you hard when that happens. That sense of reality hits you. Here is something that you wrote in the book. You talked about burning and how it could be a transporter you toward a type of ecstasy.
Yeah.
And that was something that caught my eye, almost because as a body burns. I think you mentioned something, the fact that your nerves are the first to go, and that there's no feeling there as you're going through this. And to me, that would be the most horrific way to go ever.
Absolutely.
But this sense of being transported to ecstasy, I just wanted you to talk about that a little bit.
I think I did write romantically about it in the book, but to be clear, burning and drowning are bottom two ways to go. I'm not interested, But I did, when I read that, because I was so interested in the science of burning, and I read that thing about the nerves. Once fire burns through the nerves, you lose the ability to kind of feel, and so there is an awareness of what is happening to you, but not as pain is not present. And to me, perhaps similar. I don't know. I reference this movie every 2 days of my life, so forgive me. But has anyone seen The Prestige? So there's the whole thing where he's like, in the first half of the movie, I promise I won't go deep into this, but even this movement in the film is a magic trick. The movie is about magic. But in the first act, Cutter tells the magician, I knew a sailor who drowned once, because this magician's wife drowns in a magic trick, and to comfort him, his mentor says, I know a sailor who drowned, and he said it felt like going home. And then at the end of the film, when the magician has obtained an absurd amount of power and he himself has drowned in the power and made some awful decisions, Cutter says, I remember when I told you about the sailor. And the magician says, yeah, you said drowning felt like going home. Cutter puts his hand on his shoulder and says, I lied, it was agony. And so even this idea, what I mentioned in the book is that no one has any kind of scientific sense of what burning actually is. This is all anecdotal. And so there's a way that even ecstasy is a myth. This idea of exiting the world, and I even write about that skepticism in the book. I have a hard time believing that any exit from the world is not without its pain. And I don't think it matters if it is physical anguish, but if you are at least aware that you are exiting or planning to exit, to me that is enough anguish to sustain.
I have two more for you. Is there anything that you learned from the process of writing this book that changed your mind when you started from when you finished?
Yeah, I think thanks to whoever bought me these flowers, by the way. I think that I learned about my capacity for patience. This was such a patient book to write because in my brain I thought I was writing a different book. I thought I was writing almost like a LeBron-esque biography, like a LeBron, Ohio in the time of LeBron James was the pitch to my publisher. And they said, that sounds great. And in my head I was like, but that doesn't mean anything, which, if any of you are thinking about publishing a book, just if it sounds great, that's all it takes. You know what I mean? I was like, this means nothing at all. But as I sat down to write, the book became about mortality and time and my father. And I learned to have more grace for myself and my father. You know what I learned? The one thing I learned, I will say, perhaps ultimately, is that I am becoming my father in ways that both delight me and frighten me, which means that I am almost required to have grace for my father because whether I want to or not, I'm accelerating towards him. And so to have grace for him now is to have grace for the version of myself that is going to arrive, whether I like it or not.
Have you done this yet? Have you seen a photo of your father or a photo of yourself and you say, damn, I look just like my dad?
There's a photo, actually, I found, a lot of this book was going through photo archives. There's a photo of my father holding me. He's around my age, holding me when I was a baby. Yeah. And I was like, oh shit. You know what I mean? Like, we were exactly alike, alike.
That's a scary moment. I've shared that one. And so the last question I have for you, like, you know, you've had some crossroads in your life, and, you know, one would say that it did a 180, a 360, whatever you want to call it, to get to the point where you are now from where you were, some of the issues that you faced. What would you say was a driving factor, the driving force that led you to where you are now from where you were?
I mean, I just wasn't very good at, you know, I got arrested all the time, which suggested to me that I wasn't good at doing the crime that I was doing, you know what I mean? I wasn't very good at it, which I know that's silly, but honestly, I hit a point where the last time I got arrested and went to court was for theft, you know, it was always theft of some sort. And the judge was like, you know, you've been on probation for a long time, you're kind of out of probations, you're out of chances, but I'm gonna do this for you. Either you serve 6 months, or you volunteer at this senior center for a year and we take this charge off the record. And back then I was young and silly, so I was like, I'll serve the 6 months. Like, I don't want to volunteer with a bunch of old people. That was my whole thing. I was like, I'll serve the 6 months. Thinking, as we know, I was like, I'll serve maybe 3, you know, and be out. And thankfully I had a lawyer at the time who was like, no, he'll do the year at the senior center. And truly, I did that year, and that was, I was 25, so that was like 15 years ago. I haven't left since. I've been there ever since. And I have a community of elders that I fell into when I was in my early mid-20s who didn't ask for me to be better. They weren't operating on this binary of you were bad and now you have to get better. It was just, we just need you to show up and play cards. We just need you to show up and listen to these stories about the things in our lives. We just need someone to listen to us while we gossip. And wanting to be reliable was more urgent to me than wanting to be good. Because I think one perhaps flowed into the other, but in that moment, I thought, I just want to be present for these people. I want to be present for these elders, and in order to do that, I need to stay out of trouble for a week, and then 2 weeks, and then maybe another few weeks. And that, to me, was motivation. I wanted to be reliable, and if that led to being good in some sense, and that also was I think that is still my motivation. I think I want to be reliable and available for the people I love, or could love, or might love, and that to me is a type of goodness worth pursuing that is more complicated than I stayed out of trouble, you know.
And lastly, before we open it up for questions to the audience, who's your favorite NBA team now?
I'm a Minnesota Timberwolves fan, unfortunately. Well, fortunately recently, but unfortunately for much of my life. Unfortunately for sure, like at least 20 years of my life, but hey.
They had a nice run though this past year.
Nice run. I think, you know, I see an NBA Finals berth in the future. Like this year, I feel it.
Ant-Man's pretty good.
Yeah.
He's pretty good.
Do you like him as a player?
I do. He's tremendous.
Yeah. What do you think of his shot selection?
He's learning. He's learning. He's a babe. He's learning.
Yeah.
So, but we could open it up for questions. Anybody? Now remember, there are no dumb questions. They're just dumb people.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to hear you speak. I had a question about the process of writing this book. You said it was a patient, but like you had to be patient with it, and I was wondering, like, how did you kind of like manage that, or how would you suggest managing that, like letting the book be what it was going to be?
Yeah, this to get into the weeds of this. I'm glad you asked that. Thank you. Every book that I write, I do something called draft 0.5, where I write about 35,000 words, and then set it aside and start again. I don't throw it away, but I set it aside because what I'm doing is teaching myself how to write. The thing about it is, I dreamed this book for a long time, but the thing is, our dreams are limitless and our abilities have actual, real, tangible limits. And the fact of writing for me is like any other thing. I'm trying to build a bridge between my dreaming and my limitations. And the more I shrink that bridge, the easier everything is, you know, the easier getting to the other side of it is. And draft 0.5 is me saying, I want to shrink the bridge enough that the actual work is smooth. And so This book was hard because the form of it, for those who don't know, it's shaped like a basketball game, so there's a countdown clock that runs through it. And I remember in draft 0.5, I was writing the numbers. I was writing out these numbers in the language, and so the book was governed by this form and not by the beauty of the language. And I sent it to, I keep saying it was Ross Gay, the poet Ross Gay, and I'm not sure if that's true, but I'm pretty sure it was, because I feel like this is advice he would give me. I sent it to, let's say Ross Gay as a stand-in, but I'm like 99% sure it was him. I sent it to Ross Gay, and he said this thing that was like, you are allowing yourself to be governed by form, and that is going to be the undoing of this book if you continue. And so what I did as I moved from draft 0.5 to draft 1 was I took all the numbers out and just wrote the book straight through, and then figured out how to do those line breaks. Because I'll be real, there's some stuff in the book that if you are not a deeply close reader, I think you can enjoy it at any point, but there's some stuff where it's like there's syntax breaks and like line breakage around these like countdown clock things that were vital to the breakage and vital to the sound. There's that whole thing where there's like the biblical passages mirroring the time, and there's also the thing where like I talk about the king being beheaded and his head being in the shed, and then like 5 movements later, I am in the shed hiding from the police. In those 5 movements, within those 5 movements, it's the same stretch as a biblical sequence. Anyway, there's all that stuff that is happening that is mostly there to impress me and not, and not to impress anyone else. But all of that is embedded in the book because there were moments where I was like, I need to pull this off so that I know I'm capable. I have no problem with lying to myself about my abilities if it makes the actual product something close to what the lie is, you know? If I tell myself I'm the greatest writer alive, even if I don't think that's true, it's because I need to pull off these tricks to show myself I'm capable of doing the easier things in the book. Like when I pulled off the thing with the king's head and me in the shed, I was like, okay, the rest of this chapter is clarifying. When I pulled off that shit with like the Dick Snyder shot in the sunset and the game 7 as sunset, I was like, everything else is clarified. So a lot of the book was me doing these very large movements that I think impress only me, but I needed to impress myself to do the mundane work of writing.
So actually, what you just said brings to mind another question, which is, given like the deeply personal nature of not just this book, but basically your entire oeuvre, I'm wondering, is there a dichotomy for you between writing for yourself and writing with an audience in mind? And I'm asking particularly given the, you know, what you just said with regards to the sort of literary pyrotechnics that you are reaching for yourself and that you need to convince yourself you're able to pull off.
Yeah, I don't ever think about audience, but I do think about a desire to be good, not for me, even if I need to lie to myself for the sake of the pyrotechnics. But I think about a desire to be good because I don't believe you know this, as we don't write alone. And when I say we don't write alone, I'm talking in a sense of lineage and ancestors, but also in a sense of our living actual peers. Like I want to be good because I know you Tochi, are like somewhere being good, right? Like I know you are somewhere trying to be good. I know that E-viewing is somewhere trying to be good. Kaveh Akbar is somewhere trying to be good. And for me to not at least attempt that is betrayal. It's treasonous almost to the ummah, as it were, you know, the body. And that, as much as it would be treasonous to the lineage I sit in, there's the old lie that my basketball coach, many of our basketball coaches would tell us: we get up early, you know, we wake up early, we go to the gym, we shoot around. The coaches always say, you know, only people awake right now, you and Michael Jordan, you and Michael Jordan, you know. And I had a coach who said that, and I feel like a lot of people had coaches who said that, so it was me. Thank you for, like, truly thank you for avoiding that cliche. Because it's like, now I get older, it's like, well, it was me, Michael Jordan, and like 100 other kids. But that mindset of, I am not necessarily writing for myself, perhaps the content in some ways is, but the actual rigor and care and exuberance that I try to examine and put forth in my writing is happening with an attempt to be good, because I understand that I'm writing in lockstep with a whole bunch of other people I care for who are doing work that I admire, and I don't want to be left behind, because to be left behind is not only a lonely place from a craft standpoint or creative standpoint, but it's also a betrayal to this kind of competitiveness, which isn't to say I want to be better than you, or I want to be better than Eve, or I want to be better than Kaveh. I want to be good alongside you. And that, to me, is more compelling from a competitive standpoint.
Hi.
Yo.
Sorry. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about, I guess, for people who are interested in learning about the lived experiences of their parents or grandparents, especially about incidents that are especially traumatic and that the person would not or would be like really potentially uncomfortable talking to someone about, but like there's still like a feeling on the part of the descendant to like learn, because in some way that event has like effects on that person's life, like their descendant's life.
So wait, can I get a, so the question is, how do you go about the learning?
Yeah, like how would like what advice would you give about like learning about like that event, what happened, and also just like exploring like, you know, that person's relationship to it.
Thank you for that question, fam. When she was younger, my mother wrote for a radical black newspaper in New York called 40 Acres. And no one knew of this. My mother was a writer, as folks maybe heard me talk about a bit yesterday. And no one knew of this really, except of course my father. And last year, my brother found a bunch of her old papers in a box, like a bunch of these old newspapers wherein she had written some poems, some essays, these things. And I had never read my mother's writing, ever, in my life. And so my brother kind of rescued these from the boxes in my father's garage and summoned me to come look at them. And one of my mother's poems, I remember reading it and saying, oh, this is the exact same language bank that I use, the exact same image bank that I use. It's like about God and death and dragging, the poem is about dragging death through a desert. And I remember being like, without even knowing it, you know, my mother didn't talk to me about writing. She wasn't like workshopping. I wasn't writing when I was a kid. You know, she died before I even became a writer. And so without even knowing it, there is an entire architecture of language, image, and metaphor that I am carrying of my mother's, which I mean to say, for me, it's vital to understand the worlds our parents inhabited before we arrived to them. I talked about this a tiny bit yesterday, but the worlds that our parents and the lives our parents lived before our lives intersected with theirs, it's so vital for me to understand that, because that allows me to both mourn my mother more effectively and celebrate who she was independent of me. Because if I convince myself that my world began with her and her world began with me, then that diminishes the fullness of her person, and therefore I'm only grieving a fraction of her. And I also think if I'm only grieving a fraction of her, that does not do justice to the grief that I would like to hold, which is abundant. I can't grieve abundantly in fractions, you feel me? And so this might not be answering your question, I think, but the way that I approach this is out of necessity. It is a necessity for me to understand the fullness of the people I've left behind, who have left me behind, or who I've left behind in some ways, like if I've exited life. Because for me, grief is something I need a whole. I need the whole. You know, I need the whole person to sustain me through my grieving, which is also to say I need the whole person to sustain me through memory, which is also to say I need a whole person to sustain me in the pleasures that come with arriving at a memory of someone who is no longer here.
Thank you for being you. Thank you for being here. I'm wondering, it's a two-part question. So the Nina Simone quote that it's an artist's duty to reflect the times. I wonder how that, one, what you think of that, and two, how does that land for you as one who puts out books in particular, but also in this present moment of Palestinian genocide, of people in this country dying every day for not having health care, from mass incarceration. So one, what do you think of the quote at large? And then two, how does that land for you in this current day and time?
Yeah, I'm not, in terms of the quote, I love Nina Simone deeply. I'm not super prescriptive because there are some artists I maybe don't want reflecting the times, if I'm being real. Like I feel like some artists simply aren't equipped. And I'm deeply aware, I love June Jordan very much. June Jordan is a poet who I find just not only the work, but of course the political principles and all these things. And I am bothered when I hear writers say, my art is my politics in some ways. Because I don't think of my art has my politics embedded in it, truly. But my art is not, in June Jordan's poem, Apologies to All the People in Lebanon, she writes effectively about the money she earned as a poet, paying the taxes which are going to bomb and displace people, specifically in Palestine, who had to live in Lebanon, right? Who had to traverse their way to Lebanon due to mass displacement. And so I'm deeply aware of the complicity of the money I earn as an art maker, right? Which means that I think I have a duty to reflect politics in my art, but more importantly, and perhaps more urgently, I have a duty to have a rigorous and principled politic that shows up in the entirety of the world I operate in. So should anyone's art reflect the times? Sure, but I think more importantly, a person's political rigor should reflect the times, especially if you are an American who just by function of earning money is complicit in all. We are complicit in the upholding of the mass incarceration. We are complicit in not even actively. It's frightening perhaps to be passively complicit in that, but we are because we pay taxes, And so to operate against that, look, I write with, I correspond with incarcerated folks often, and I have for a long time. I think that's one major, unshakable part of my politic is correspondence with people who are imprisoned and incarcerated. And that alone, I think, has shaped the level of urgency with which I understand that my perhaps books, even if my politics are imbued in my books, are not nearly as political as it is to receive correspondence and then reply to correspondence from someone who has been dehumanized to a point that one must jump through immense hoops even to get a letter to them, right? And so I don't make any, I'm pretty clear on what the limits of my art making is, which isn't to say my politics aren't deep in it. It's just to say that I understand the stakes for people who are not me. And to say my politics are my art would be selfish when there are people hungry right now who cannot eat off anything in my books, right? And there are people incarcerated right now who have not heard from a loved one in so long because COs are taking their mail and throwing it away. And there are people who are being bombed by bombs that have the stamps of America. These things are tangible. So I say that to say there are better things and more urgent things I can do with politics in my language than to have the ego, for me, to have the ego to suggest that to write a poem is to change the world. Sometimes writing a poem changes my interior world. It isn't that nice, but the work has to extend for me beyond that.
Thank you so much. My question is kind of related to audience again. I sometimes interact with your work mentioning it to young people who engage in fandom, and I think being able to tell them that there's a person and several people who have taken fandom and have turned that into their career and write it very beautifully, and I see them being geniuses engaging with how they think of fandom, and I'm interested for you unearthing how you thought about all your interests as a young person, how you would write back either to yourself or your own peers for that age group of maybe teenagers, preteens, to affirm that as a kind of genius in itself.
You know what's wild to me? So I work with young writers. I work with high school writers in Columbus, a small handful. And every year I work with a new group. They come in, it's all volunteer. It's all volunteer. On one Sunday a month, we sit in a room and we just workshop each other's poems. They workshop my poems with the same rigor and care that I workshop theirs with. In the first act of that, every single year, is convincing them, and myself in some ways, that to be excited about something is fine and normal, because they already are. All of us already are. And I think there's something now, and perhaps when I was a teenager too, where we get that excitement beaten out of us by shame. I'm ashamed to be this excited about this thing because someone might make fun of me. And so it's cool to sit in a room with a bunch of 16 and 17-year-olds and say, how can we collectively convince each other that there is actually no shame in exuberance and excitement, because that's the entire machinery of what we're trying to do. There's always this year, I know it traverses some heavy things, but I wanted that book to read the most exuberant thing I'd ever written because it was so fun to write. So in so much of my work now, I don't read much about myself, thankfully. But I remember skimming something, I skimmed a review, and it said at this point, Hanif Abdurraqib's main industry is a guy who is excited about things. And I think that's great. I love that. And that wasn't like that was said in praise, I suppose. Or at least I hope. But I love that. I love that idea because I'm the youngest of 4. And so I spent a lot of time alone as a kid. Not because I was in a neglected household. It's just that I don't know if anyone else is the youngest and grew up in a poor family, but when you're young, everyone has their things. People got jobs, and so I spent a lot of time alone. And I spent a lot of time making mixtapes off the radio. I talked about this recently in an interview that some people might have heard. And there was nothing to me like waiting all day for a song and then hearing it introduced by a DJ and then being able to record it. I'd bottle that feeling if I could. I'm chasing that feeling all the time because I know it exists in other things. People ask all the time why I spend so much time listening to new music. I'm never going to be one of those people who says there's no good music now. I'm seeking all the time because when I was a kid, I was a kid at the dawn, like a real golden era of college radio. When I was a kid, I remember one of my older siblings coming home with a tape that they recorded off college radio, pressing play, and I remember in 1991 being 7 or 8 and hearing the opening riffs of It Smells Like Teen Spirit for the first time and being like, what the fuck is happening? And I want that all the time. The first time I heard Black Belt Eagle Scout, like the first time I heard the last Black Belt Eagle Scout album, when I heard My Blood Runs Through This Land, I was like, and that was like last year, I thought, my brain is being altered by this. The first time I heard Black Star Kids, I was like, my brain is being altered by this. The first time I heard like Charlie XCX's Pop 2, I was like, brain altering experience. And I want that. I want that in everything. I don't have patience now for things that are not at least having the potential to bring me to a point of exuberance in my consumption of things I enjoy, in my relationships, in all of it. And yeah, of course I do some mindless TV watching or some mindless scrolling or some mindless things, but it's always like there might be something in here that embeds itself in my brain and heart for a long time. And with enough of those things, if I can stitch together a quilt of excitements that have embedded themselves in my brain and heart for a long time, then I've got a life. I would like to maybe write that to my younger self. Don't stop seeking the things that bring you excitement, and don't stop being an evangelist for those excitements, because to mention The Prestige once again. Does anyone remember the monologue at the end of The Prestige where Angier is talking to Christian Bale's character, and he's like, you never appreciated why we did this? And you learn that the fundamental, I'm spoiling this movie, but it's like 21 years old, so I think the embargo's up. You realize that the difference between the two magicians is that the whole point Angier's making is, I did this because of the look on people's faces. You did this because you wanted to be good for yourself. I did this because there's something spectacular in the miracle of saying, I've shown you something that you know you can't find anywhere else. I kind of want to be that kind of person. I want to find the things that move me like nothing else can. And I want to see the looks on people's faces, if I can for a moment, show that to them. Because then I am holding up a patch on my quilt of excitements and saying, this is how you make this for yourself. And this is how you can make it for someone else and someone else. And then, with enough of that, we got a pretty big quilt.